The running back position is really weird in fantasy football. There's a lot of good options each and every week, but at some point of the rankings, the drop-off is ginormous. The last thing you want to do is start running backs that really aren't going to give you a great opportunity at fantasy points. That's why you need to follow the quick and dirty top 36 running backs for week 11. That's right, today we're going to be going through my top 36 running backs, but before I do, just like we do every single week, let's talk about a few of my bigger hits and misses from just last week. And when it comes to a few of the bigger hits, how about Tyrone Tracy, Christian McCaffrey, and Breece Hall? Now for Tyrone Tracy, I told everyone last week, you start your running backs against the Carolina Panthers. It's a must. He finishes the running back 10. Christian McCaffrey, we somewhat limited expectations, ranked him as the running back 11, finished as the running back 12 on the week, and then Breece Hall. I didn't fall for it. It was a good matchup, right? A quote-unquote good matchup against Arizona. I ranked him as the RB15. He finished as the RB20, but I had some big-time misses as well. Chuba Hubbard, DeAndre Swift, and Bucky Irving. For Chuba, I guess going forward, the quarterback and the matchup just don't seem to matter. The guy's going to run the ball successfully. DeAndre Swift, that overall offense in Chicago is a dumpster fire. And then Bucky Irving, I didn't expect him and Rachaad White to both have top 8 finishes in week 10 against the San Francisco 49ers. Neither Bucky or Chuba were ranked high enough last week. But we live and learn, and we move on to week 11. Let's bring up tier 1 for the running back position. And as you can see here in tier 1, we got Saquon Barkley, Joe Mixon, Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Kyren Williams, and Alvin Kamara. Now at the top, we got Saquon Barkley going up against Washington, and obviously, he has not been benefiting here as of late from Jalen Hurts stealing all these rushing touchdowns. Hurts and his 8 rushing touchdowns over the last month or so of the season is definitely hurting Saquon Barkley, but he's still averaging over 20 touches a game in one of the better offenses in the NFL, and is still averaging career highs in all rushing metrics. Now they have a matchup going up against Washington, who allows just under 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I don't know about you, but I'm hoping for a back and forth shootout in this matchup. Got Saquon at 1. 2 is Joe Mixon going up against Dallas, and he's really not getting enough fantasy credit. He is averaging the second most fantasy points per game at the running back position. The only guy averaging more is Derrick Henry. Mixon has had at least 90 yards and a touchdown in all but one game this season. The one in which he didn't get that, he only played in 47% of the snaps due to injury. Now a matchup going up against Dallas, they allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we go down to Christian McCaffrey going up against Seattle. He had 19 touches in his first game back, and that's a great sign. Now he looked a little bit rusty, but that's to be expected. But like we've said all along, you held him this long for a reason. If he's active, if he's playing, if he's healthy, he's in your lineup no matter where I rank him on a weekly basis. This happens to be a good matchup though going up against Seattle. They allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we got Derrick Henry going up against Pittsburgh. And how good has the King been? He's the current running back 1 in fantasy football, has 30 fantasy points more than the running back 2 overall, has had at least 10 fantasy points in every game this season, at least 1 touchdown in every game this season. He's averaging 19.4 touches per game, and he ranks number 1 overall in the NFL in rushing yards. Now a matchup going up against Pittsburgh, not easy. They allow the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but the King is always near the top of the rankings. Which takes us to number 5, Bijan Robinson with a matchup going up against Denver, and he's on an absolute heater right now. 5 straight games over 100 total yards and 6 touchdowns over that same 5-game span. He's averaging over 20 touches per game in those 5 games as well. Now a matchup going up against Denver, they allow just over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. It's easier to run on Denver than it is to throw on Denver. And we've kind of seen that as of late because 3 of the last 5 running backs that have faced this Broncos defense have scored at least 13 fantasy points. I got Bijan at number 5. Then we got Jahmyr Gibbs at number 6. He's going up against Jacksonville, and he's remained one of the safest running backs here in 2024. Hasn't had less than 10 fantasy points in a game yet this season, and through his first 9 games of 2024, he's only 332 total yards and 3 touchdowns away from his entire 2023 totals. Now he gets a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we move down to Kyren Williams at number 7, going up against New England. Back-to-back games with no touchdowns. That kind of sucks for Kyren Williams owners, but the volume is still there. The yardage just hasn't been. He's had less than 100 total yards now in 3 of his last 4 games. But this is a good matchup for him going up against New England because they allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and 7 of the last 8 opponents of New England have rushed for over 110 yards. Which will take us to the last name here inside Tier 1. It's Alvin Kamara going up against Cleveland. If this offense could score some touchdowns outside of the occasional big plays, Alvin Kamara would be the running back 1 overall. He only has 2 touchdowns over his last 8 games. Now, he does have 3 straight games over 100 total yards, and we know that New Orleans is starved for offensive weapons. Cleveland, though, a little bit easier to throw on than run on, so I'm hoping that Alvin Kamara can get at least 7 targets in this game to give us that safe fantasy floor. Alright, now before we dive into Tier 2, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, SeatGeek. And I know you've heard of them before. They're the #1 rated ticketing app out there. There are more than 70,000 events currently on SeatGeek that you could get tickets for. And they make it really easy for you to find the best deals. Because each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10. So just go in there and look for the green dots. Green means good, red means bad. But you know, if I'm going to talk about it, I'm also going to give you an additional discount. If you use our code HEADLINERS at checkout, you're going to get $20 off at SeatGeek. I mean, come on, the Christmas season is right around the corner. You need to start buying some Christmas presents. I have found in the past that one of the best things you can do for Christmas is get yourself and a friend, a family member, a significant other, a ticket to an event. Because you get to cross Christmas present off your list, but you also get to go as well. So yes, like I said, that's $20 off using the promo code HEADLINERS over on SeatGeek. Download the app. Look for more information down below in the description of this video. But alright, let's dive into Tier 2. And that's where we got Kareem Hunt, Jonathan Taylor, Devon Achane, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Josh Jacobs, David Montgomery, and James Cook. Now for Kareem Hunt, he's going up against the Buffalo Bills. And sure, Isaiah Pacheco is getting close to returning, but it's not going to be this week, which means Kareem Hunt is going to continue racking up touches. He's had at least 21 touches now in 5 straight ball games, and either had 100 total yards or a touchdown in all 5 of those games as well. Now a matchup going up against Buffalo, they allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we move down to Jonathan Taylor going up against the Jets. This Indy front office is absolutely clueless. The way they handle things makes absolutely no sense, but facts are facts. Jonathan Taylor averages 17 fantasy points per game with Anthony Richardson under center, only 8.2 with Joe Flacco. Now a matchup going up against the Jets, they allow 20 fantasy points per game to the running back position, and they've allowed over 110 yards rushing in 8 of the 10 games this season. Then we move down to Devon Achane going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, coming off his worst game of the season with Tua under center. He's now scored single-digit fantasy points in 5 of his last 7 games. But honestly, it really seems like he continues to get ranked highly and started by everyone just because of the weekly possible potential. He's got a matchup winning ceiling, and in a matchup going up against Las Vegas, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, I had to keep him up inside the top 12. Then we move down to Breece Hall going up against Indianapolis. 3 straight games of barely hovering around 10 fantasy points is not ideal. This Jets team is just impossible to figure out. As soon as they start to look a little bit better, they totally crap the bed. Now, Indianapolis is a middle-of-the-pack defense against opposing running backs, and that's exactly why the expectations have been lowered for Breece Hall. How about Kenneth Walker going up against the 49ers coming off the bye week? The current running back, 18 overall, averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game. He faced this same San Francisco defense just a couple weeks ago and had 69 total yards and a touchdown. Nice. Seattle is just a pass-heavy offense, and that makes the Walker ceiling just a little bit more hit or miss. Seattle needs to run the ball a lot this week. Keep it away from Brock Purdy and the San Francisco 49ers. If they do that, they have a better chance of winning, so Kenneth Walker's at 13. 14 is Josh Jacobs going up against Chicago, another running back coming off the bye week. He's been a solid RB2 most of the season. He's had at least 90 yards now in 5 straight games, and now gets a matchup going up against Chicago, who allows 20.6 fantasy points per game to the running back position. They have allowed at least 119 yards rushing in 6 of their last 7 games to their opponents. Which brings us down to David Montgomery of the Lions going up against Jacksonville, and he found his way back in the end zone last week, but it was a tough matchup against Houston. A much better opportunity this week going up against Jacksonville, who allows the 5th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. You have to think he finds the end zone again here in week 11. And then we got James Cook going up against Kansas City. And Buffalo's playing so well and basically with a lead every single week, and that's really helping out James Cook. He's had a touchdown in all but 3 games this season, and he's on pace for over 1,400 total yards and 17 touchdowns. But don't get me wrong, this matchup sucks. James Cook has never had a rushing touchdown against Kansas City, and no team in the NFL allows fewer fantasy points per game to the running back position than the Kansas City Chiefs, so that's why James Cook is all the way at the bottom of tier 2. So down to tier 3 we go. It's DeAndre Swift, Aaron Jones, Chase Brown, J.K. Dobbins, Nick Chubb, Ramondre Stevenson, Brian Robinson Jr., and Tony Pollard. For DeAndre Swift, he's going up against Green Bay. And with no Shane Waldron in Chicago as the offensive coordinator, what now for the Bears? They have to get better, right? Well, it's not like new offensive coordinator Thomas Brown is some proven offensive genius. I mean, he was the offensive coordinator briefly in Carolina last year, but there is a lot of unknown with the future surrounding DeAndre Swift. Thomas Brown being a former running back and a former running backs coach, though, I have a feeling will lean on the running game to take some pressure off of Caleb Williams. That's why I got DeAndre Swift still at 17. At 18, it's Aaron Jones, though, going up against Tennessee, and it seems like every single week Aaron Jones is getting crushed, leaving hurt, and then coming back into the ball game. He's currently questionable with a rib injury, but is expected to play in a matchup going up against Tennessee. They allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got Chase Brown going up against the Chargers, and how many of you out there, by a show of hands in the comment section, drafted Chase Brown due to him being one of our top sleepers in this offseason's draft guide? I'm curious to see how many people took that advice this offseason, because he's the current running back 15 overall, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season, and has had at least 10 plus fantasy points in 6 of his last 7 games. He also just had a season high in targets and receptions. In a matchup going up against Los Angeles, he's going to need him, because they allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. But we're not totally writing off Chase Brown just due to the matchup. He produced last week against Baltimore. He can do it again this week. Then we got J.K. Dobbins going up against Cincinnati, and I'm not a Dobbins hater by any means. I just don't put him up on a pedestal. People want this guy ranked super high each and every week, and then when he comes out and does nothing, it's pure silence. I prefer to just keep it fact-based. He's averaged under 4 yards per carry in 6 of the 9 games this season, has single-digit fantasy production in 4 of his last 7 games, and now he has a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. With Gus Edwards healthy, and now all of a sudden Justin Herbert running the ball a lot himself, I got J.K. Dobbins down at number 20. 21, that's where I got Nick Chubb going up against the Saints. He's coming off the bye, and now is the time for Chubb to show he is capable of what we used to see from him. Because if we don't, it may be best just to look forward to 2025. In this matchup going up against New Orleans, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Chubb, he's had at least 16 touches in back-to-back games prior to the bye, so the time is now. Now after him, we got Ramondre Stevenson going up against the Rams, and he remains a mid to low-end running back too, just due to the inconsistencies. He's going to be a touchdown-dependent type of guy on a team that just doesn't score a lot of consistent touchdowns. Now the Rams, they're easier to throw on than run on, so he's going to need some of that passing volume this week, which will then take us down to Brian Robinson Jr. going up against Philadelphia. He's back at practice as a full go. Sounds like he's going to be out there in week 11, but how much do they continue to use Austin Eckler? Plus this matchup is not great. Philadelphia is one of the best run defenses in the entire NFL, so in his first game back off of injury, I got Brian Robinson down here at 23, and then we got Tony Pollard going up against Minnesota. Between the tough matchup and the return of Tajay Spears last week, it really hurt Tony Pollard. Well, this matchup is almost just as tough, and Spears is still going to be out there this week. Minnesota allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and with the split in touches, a lot of risk with Tony Pollard. Which will then lead us down to tier 4. It's Travis Etienne, Rico Dowdle, Alexander Madison, Jalen Warren, Audric Estime, and Austin Eckler. Now for Etienne, he's going up against Detroit, and we saw Tank Bigsby re-injure his ankle last week. We already know that Trevor Lawrence has been ruled out for this game, so this is time for Etienne to shine, right? Unfortunately, they're facing Detroit, and they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and I have a feeling that Detroit is going to get an early lead in this matchup, forcing Jacksonville to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters. Etienne is really going to need a big play to outproduce this ranking here this week. Then we go down to Rico Dowdle going up against Houston, and I think it's safe to say with Dak done for the year, and the Dallas offense looking like something you see at parks from dads on Thanksgiving weekend, that it's safe to say that touchdowns aren't going to be happening very often. And in a matchup matchup going up against Houston, who allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. Rico Dowdle's down here in tier 4. Then we got Alexander Madison going up against Miami. Coming off the bye week, we know that Gardner Minshew is back under center, and he's going against Miami, which on paper struggles against opposing running backs. However, they just limited Kyren Williams last week. Now, Madison has had at least 17 touches in 4 of the last 5 games he's played, so he's going to remain a mid-flex option in week 11. Then we got Jaylen Warren going up against Baltimore, and when it comes to Warren, this has everything to do with the availability of Najee Harris. Najee currently questionable, and Baltimore is way easier to throw on than run on. Warren could benefit from some checkdowns, but will be a huge risk unless Najee Harris is ruled out. Then we got Audric Estime going up against Atlanta. Said his role was going to increase last week, and boy did it. Had 14 touches in week 10. Jaleel McLaughlin and Javonte Williams had a total 5 touches combined. Estime didn't do anything great, but he didn't do anything bad either, so expect him to get another shot this week going up against Atlanta, who does allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position. And then we got Austin Eckler here to round out tier 4 going up against Philadelphia. And really this has everything to do with the health of B-Rob, because we know he's back at practice now at the time of this recording, but Eckler has put together back-to-back games over 15 fantasy points in his absence. Another tough matchup going up against Philadelphia this week though. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so if B-Rob's 100% good to go, we had to limit Austin Eckler and drop him to the bottom of tier 4, which only leaves us tier 5, and it's at this point of the rankings that it gets really ugly. There's nothing to be excited about going forward. Now in this tier we got Zach Charbonnet, Tyler Algier, Raheem Mostert, Tajay Spears, Javonte Williams, and Najee Harris. For Charbonnet, he hasn't had over 8 touches in a game since week 3. Really hard to score fantasy points if you're not touching the football. Tyler Algier, he only has 1 game all year with over 10 fantasy points, and I don't know if you've noticed or not lately, but Bijan is absolutely feasting. What about Raheem Mostert going up against the Raiders? Mostert actually had 0 carries in last week's game, only 2 receptions, and played a season low in snaps. Tajay Spears, he's going against Minnesota, a crazy tough matchup, and he's splitting touches with Tony Pollard. Javonte Williams, he's going up against Atlanta, and he all but disappeared last week when Estime got his shot. A lot of the same is probably going to happen this week. How about Najee Harris going up against Baltimore? He's currently questionable to play. We know this is a tough matchup because Baltimore allows some of the fewest fantasy points per game to the running back position, and with Jaylen Warren getting more volume, we really need to see the availability of Najee Harris. So there you have the quick and dirty top 36 running backs for week 11. There's really 24 solid options, and then after that, it gets a little bit dicey. But as you're watching the show today, did you feel like you need more rankings? Do you need more help? Are you looking for flex rankings, kicker rankings, defense rankings? We do those as well. They're actually a member perk, so consider hitting the join button just below the video. Not only are you going to get those bonus rankings, you're going to get other members-only content, a members-only live stream on Sunday mornings, and most importantly, access to our Discord. It is hands down the best Discord in the entire fantasy football space. And I can say that because we got no trolls or asshats that you have to deal with. Just a bunch of like-minded people that want to enjoy the game of fantasy football. Now, if you haven't hit the like button yet, please do so here on your way out. It greatly helps us on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics, off the chain, all the channels, not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.